You are such a genuine gem. Thank you for clicking on my video. I'm Brooke McKenna, but today's case is a solved case about Shasta Groene, who was kidnapped by a serial killer. Now, this case has a family murder, kidnapping victims, and a killer on the run. It has it all. There is even a survivor that had no idea if her instincts would save her or not, and a connection to two other possible murder cases, and an arrest that no one would see coming. By the way, I post so much content like this. It is my absolute passion to tell these stories, and I mean absolutely no harm or disrespect when I do so. So if it's something you would like to support me in doing, all you have to do is make sure you are subscribed with the post notification bell on, and give this video a thumbs up and leave a nice comment down below. Now let's get back to the story. So it was 2005 in Idaho, and the Groene family lived in a place called Coeur, and this was Brenda and her three children, who were Slade, Dylan, and Shasta, and they all lived with their stepfather, who was named Mark McKenzie. Now, Slade was the oldest at 13 years old, Dylan was 9, and Shasta was 8, and they were all a happy family living in a small home. And the night of May 16th, they were actually having a barbecue for their entire, family and friends to come and attend, and it wouldn't last long because the children actually had to go to bed for school the next morning. And so that is exactly what they did. However, they wouldn't be attending. The kids would not go to school, and the adults would not be going to work. Neighbors would go to their home upon seeing cars in the driveway, and they would find a front door covered in blood, and they immediately called the police. The police barged in, not knowing what they would expect. They opened the door, and they found blood everywhere. There were two adults and a child, and they were lying lifeless. This was found to be Brenda, Mark, and Slade. Now, at this point, they looked around for anyone else in the home, and they found no one else. Pictures on the family wall showed that there were two younger kids that were nowhere to be found. They were now missing. The search was on, and billboards were actually put up around the area with their pictures as well as their names, in hopes that somebody would see them and call in. And there was 7 long weeks that they waited for any sign of these two children being still alive, because, they figured if the rest of the family members were killed at the scene and these two were taken, perhaps they were the reason for the murder, or, this person had wanted to abduct the children and didn't really care about the older children or the adults. And so they hoped that that meant that the children were still alive. But like I said, almost 2 months later, they still hadn't heard a thing. It was now July 2nd at around 2 a.m. when they would get their first tip. And this was from a local Denny's, and a waitress would call in saying, "Look, I have this little girl and this man here, and they just seem really suspicious. I think that the girl looks like Shasta, but I have no idea if it is her, but you might want to just come down here and check it out." And so, the staff actually blocked the exits. They tried to do it in the least obvious way possible, but they didn't want these two to leave. And they also made sure that their food didn't come out right away, so they couldn't just eat and leave. And then the officers showed up and immediately went to their booth and walked up to this little girl and asked her her name. And that is when this little girl would look to the man, and the man would say, "You can tell him." And that's when she would say that she was Shasta Groene. And the police would immediately arrest this man. It was a shockingly calm event. This man was arrested for kidnapping, and Shasta was taken to the hospital to provide medical treatment that she could possibly need. And Dylan was actually not found with them at this time. So news of Shasta's rescue spread throughout the community, and there were actually a lot of tips that they figured that they could find now that they knew what car they were riding in. They found that he was riding in a red Jeep Cherokee with Missouri license plates. So they asked the community for help in tracing where all they had gone through this time in hopes of finding Dylan. That is when this car was found to have been rented from Missouri and was now registered as a stolen car because it was never returned. That's when a witness from a gas station that was 40 miles away from this Denny's where she was rescued at would come forward saying that a few hours before they had found her, these two people, the man and Shasta, had walked into her gas station. And she had noticed them and they were walking around the store. She thought it was, kind of odd, and Shasta looked like the girl in the missing persons posters. However, nothing seemed that out of the ordinary. They just looked like they could be father and daughter or, uncle and niece. And so she didn't want to say anything and disturb them if she was wrong. But, that is something that we call the bystander effect, that you just feel like somebody else will do something if it is really that bad, and so you don't do anything. And this woman didn't, and it could have ended really badly. Thankfully it didn't for Shasta, but this woman came forward and said that she thought it was these two after, the man's picture had been put on the news, but then she looked back through surveillance footage and found that it was in fact them. And the footage is incredibly eerie, with her just following him around, looking around the store. However, this didn't help locate Dylan, because even the few hours before Denny's, he still wasn't with them and they didn't know where he was. And so that is when they went to Shasta, and they had tried to, put off questioning her a ton because of what she had just experienced. However, they needed to know what happened to Dylan, why he wasn't with them, and that is when she would say simply that he was no longer with them because he was in heaven with mom and dad. With that, investigators unfortunately had to shift from searching for a missing boy to searching for his remains. And Shasta also would describe to them exactly what happened to her over this 7-week period where she had been abducted, and what exactly happened the night her family was murdered, because she remembered it all. She said it was almost morning that night when her mother came in her bedroom and woke her and Dylan up and said that there was a man there in their home that didn't want them to be there anymore. And when they were ushered to the living room, she saw that this man was dressed in all black and had gloves as well as a gun. Now, she at this time also heard her stepfather, Mark, arguing with this man, and he said that if he argued with him any further, he was going to shoot Mark. And this really freaked Shasta out. And that is when they would all be bound with zip ties. Her stepfather was saying, we don't have any money, but this attacker just continued to do what he was doing like he didn't care. Shasta and Dylan were actually led out of the house and near this red Jeep Cherokee, and that is when this man would go back inside, and Shasta said that she heard screams coming from inside, and then she watched as her brother Slade came running out of the house with his face covered in blood. And while he was trying to get them out of the car, this man came up behind him and struck him over and over again, and he kind of climbed away to this picnic table that was nearby and then just fell to the ground. And this man got in the car and began driving. These two children had no idea if their family had survived that. They didn't know what death, murder meant, and they didn't know if they were going to survive this experience either. And Shasta said that they drove for quite a long distance. They stopped at a few campsites, and during this time, that is when they both began to be sexually tortured. And she said that Dylan really got the brunt of it, and all of this man's aggression was taken out on him. And she also said that he even watched them both go to the bathroom, and she felt very uncomfortable the entire time. This man then started to describe to them exactly what he had done to their family. He showed them a hammer, and he said that he beat them to death and that they would not be seeing them again because they were dead. And at this point, these two really clung to hope that they would get out of this situation, but Dylan, getting all of this abuse or a lot more than Shasta, really started to lose that hope. And so Shasta, even being the younger sister, decided to take on the role of almost like a motherly figure, a protector, and was telling Dylan, you have to keep hope. You have to know that we're going to get out of this, or believe that we are, and that they were going to make it out alive no matter what. If these two kids ever messed up, if they ever didn't do what this man was saying, or if they paid more attention to each other than this man, they would be threatened to be killed every single time. And Shasta's survival instinct really kicked in at this point, and it was strange because it's not something that she had experienced before and knew about herself. It was something that really in that moment helped her, and she didn't know where it was coming from. So she started to ask this man about his life, about who he was beyond, you know, what he was doing to these kids. And every time that he would start to talk to her, he would begin to get more comfortable. And he also got a lot nicer. And so Shasta started using this anytime he would get mad, and it kind of calmed him down. And at one point he even let them write a letter to their biological father, who of course wasn't living with them at the time and wasn't murdered. And this note said, "Dear Dad, I miss you very much, and me and Dylan know what happened to Mom, Mark, and Slade, and we both feel very sorry for them, and we miss you and Jesse and Vance, and we might see you guys again." However, this note was never sent, so there was no way that her biological father even knew that they were still alive, and he was participating in the searches. He was really trying to look for him, and for those 7 weeks nobody knew. Shasta then went into the day that was the most horrific for her, the day that her brother Dylan was murdered. She said that she was in another location from this man and Dylan, and that she heard a loud bang. And when she went to find what this noise was, she found that her brother was lying on the ground with a gunshot wound to his stomach. And that is when this man would walk over to him with his gun and put it to his head. Now, it did not go off when he tried to shoot Dylan. However, he reloaded it, and the entire time Dylan and Shasta were begging him not to do it, not to kill Dylan, but he did it anyway. And then Shasta said he started crying to her, saying that he didn't want to do that it was an accident, that he had to put Dylan out of his misery. And Shasta said she was just frozen. She couldn't say a thing, and she didn't for the next few days. But now Shasta was alone with this monster, and she said that a few days after this, the man came to her saying, "How would you like to die? Would you like to be strangled, or would you like to be shot like your brother?" He said, "Shooting you will be a lot quicker, and strangulation will hurt more." And this 8-year-old girl had to decide how she was going to be murdered. And she began to say that she wanted to be strangled. And in her mind, she thought that this gave her a chance to try to talk him out of what he was doing. Now, she said that this man walked up to her with a rope, tied it around her neck, and it began to get tighter and tighter. She was going in and out of consciousness, and that is when she got enough breath to yell out, "Jet." One word that caused him to stop what he was doing. You see, his nickname, or his family's nickname for him, was Jet. And when she said, "Stop, Jet," he instantly did. It forced him to get into another mindset, and suddenly he completely stopped. And he looked at Shasta, and he didn't finish what he was doing. Shasta had seen how much this name affected him and how nice it made him. And in that brief instance, she called it out and saved her own life. At this point, this man would ask her if she wanted to go meet his mom. Of course, she said yes, anything to get her to another human, hoping that his mother would be much better than he was and a better human. And so she said yes, and they would travel to Coeur, back to where she was from. Now, that is when they were going to pass by a Denny's, and this was around 2 a.m. And Shasta was hungry and asked him for a meal. And he had promised her that after meeting his mother, she would go home to her biological father. So, With this, he agreed to take her to Denny's, and we know what happened after that. Now, when this man was brought into custody, he said that he changed his mind about killing her because she taught him how to love. Shasta said that even when the officers got to the Denny, she still wasn't sure that they were going to be able to save her from this man. But she had survived. Because of all of her statements, 2 days after Shasta was found, her brother's remains were found as well at a campsite near St. Regis, Montana, and the memorial was on July 16th, which would have been his 10th birthday. But who was this man who was now in custody for their kidnapping? Well, he was a man who had a warrant out for his arrest for child molestation charges in Minnesota, the same place where he had stolen the car from. He was 42-year-old Joseph Edward Duncan III and had a long list of criminal history. You see, Joseph was born in 1963 and was born to a military family of 5 children who moved all the time. By the time he was 15, he would actually have his first charge on his record of assaulting a 9-year-old boy at gunpoint. Due to this, he never finished high school. He had to go into juvie for a year, and when he got out a year later, he stole a car, and this actually resulted in a high-speed chase where an officer actually pulled a gun and almost shot him in the head, but this went past him and he almost got away. From there, he was sent to a boys' home or a ranch that was said to help them learn skills to get jobs and, you know, help them transform into better adults. However, there was a therapist there, and this therapist would say that Joseph had told her that he was assaulted by 6 boys while he was there. However, he also told her that he had already assaulted 3 younger boys himself. When he was released a year later from this ranch, he went home to find that his parents were divorced and his father had moved away. And he actually was said to go into a deep depression, and he was breaking into homes and he was looking through windows trying to see women in the shower. And at 17 years old, he actually stole 4 guns from one of his neighbors' homes, as well as adult magazines and his car. And then he drove this car to a school, and he picked up a 14-year-old boy outside and forced him into the car and then forced him to provide sexual pleasure to him. But this boy couldn't do what Joseph wanted, and he actually burned him with cigarettes at this point. And Joseph believed that this boy was lucky, that he was learning new things. And this boy was absolutely traumatized. When he arrived home, he was actually met by officers and sentenced to 20 years in prison after he went to a sex offender treatment program. And when he went to this treatment program, he actually became a peeping Tom. He was like sneaking out of the program and going to these different windows. And because of that, he himself recognized it wasn't good for him and decided to just go ahead and go on to prison before finishing the program. While there in prison, Joseph was diagnosed as a sexual psychopath and 14 years later was released on parole. But only a few weeks went by before he had broken his parole and he had to go back to prison. It said that he was in possession of a firearm and he was doing marijuana, and that's why he had to go back. However, this may have not been all that he was up to during this time, and we'll get into that a little later. It would be 2000 when Joseph was officially released, and he moved away, so the local police didn't really know what happened to him. However, wherever he went, the sex offender registry was following him because he was supposed to be registering no matter where he lived. But little did they know that they could just read his blog to find out what he was doing and how he was thinking. That's right, Joseph had a blog. It was called The Fifth Nail, and he started it in January 2004 with a statement saying, "Whoever controls the media controls the country." Now, he went on to say that the only reason he was put back in prison after being released on parole was because they wanted to keep up the numbers showing that everyone who gets out of prison only goes back. And he also wrote a poem called The Power to Cry that said, "If you had the power to cry such that everyone could hear but no one understood, would you? If you had the power to change, to grow closer to God but no one could see, would you? If you had the power to die such that life never ended but no one knew, would you? During this blog, I read quite a bit of it, and he often talked about his time in prison and that life was hard for him as a sex offender, that he shouldn't have been called that he was simply just an inmate. Strangely enough, he also talked about being in a cell at one point with a well-known child molester, and that he hated this man, and that he was everything that he absolutely hated, and that basically this man was a character that not even a fiction movie would use because nobody wanted to see something that sickening. Then he would say the longer he was with this man, he started to realize that he shouldn't hate him because they were the same, because everyone's the same. Joseph said, as long as we keep attacking the symptoms of social disease, the so-called offenders, then our problems will keep getting worse. Someday, soon I hope, society will be forced to wake up and recognize how it propagates its own misery by denying the truth that criminals are victims too. Now, what really got me when looking into these entries was the fact that right before the Groene murders, he really showed some erratic behavior. And this was April of 2005, and it was a month before the murders and the abductions of the Groene family. And Joseph wrote an entry called Wrestling with Demons, where he was talking about that his demons were stronger than him, or that he gave them credit for, and he was afraid that they were going to win. He said that if they do win, that a lot of people would be badly hurt because they've had their way before, and that's what they've done before. And then May 11th, Joseph wrote that it was too late for any help, that his demons had locked up Happy Joe and put him in the same dungeon that Happy Joe put the demons in normally, and that they were loose and he was very afraid. He then wrote, to be more specific, I am scared, alone, and confused, and my reaction is to strike out toward the perceived source of my misery, society. My intent is to harm society as much as I can, then die. As for the Happy Joe, well, he was just a dream. The boogeyman was alive and happy long before Happy Joe. Then he went on to explain that when he had gotten out of prison, that he got even back then too, but he wasn't caught. Then he did it again, and he wasn't caught again. So he figured he wouldn't be this time either. He said all this because he actually did so, and in March, 2 months prior to the Groene family murders, he was actually charged with sexually assaulting 2 boys on a playground, and his bail was set at $15,000, but he actually skipped bail and disappeared, and that's why there was a warrant out for his arrest. Now, 3 days before the Groene family murders, another entry was written, the last one. Now, Joseph talked about the fact that he didn't know if taking people with him was right or wrong, because he didn't know what right or wrong was anymore, and that also that his mother was crying because her son was in trouble again and she wondered why he did these things. Joseph also mentioned he had an encrypted journal where he wrote about who he really was, what he had really done, and that nobody would ever be able to read it, because if they did, maybe then they would understand his actions, and that he wasn't a bad person. He just had a disease contracted by society, and it hurt a lot. Now Joseph was in custody, and he claimed that he didn't kill Dylan, that it really was an accident because he was looking through this clear box to get a beer, and this also had a gun in it, and it apparently went off and shot Dylan, who was, standing in the wrong spot, and then he knew that it was going to be painful if he just let him die from there, so he shot him in the head. He also admitted to why he had gone to the Groene family home, and he said that he was driving down the road when he saw Shasta and Dylan playing outside, and he decided they were going to be his next victims. Now, Joseph actually admitted to filming Dylan during his last moments, and these tapes were actually found, and you can hear Joseph screaming, "The devil is here, boy, the devil himself. The devil likes to watch children suffer and cry." But investigators still didn't think that they had the whole story at this point, because they believed that Joseph had killed long before the Groene family and had just not been caught for it. You see, back in 1996, when Joseph was 33, 2 sisters named Sammy Jo White and Carmen Cubayas, who were 11 and 9, would be found murdered in Seattle, and this was actually around the time of his parole from prison. Now, they had left Crest Motel, and they went out to the stores on their own, and they were found deceased 2 years later. There was also the murder of Anthony Martinez in California a year later. This again was said to be when Joseph was out on parole. And Anthony was said to be playing in the front yard with his friends, and that was when an unknown man came up to them and asked them for help to find his missing cat. They were all aware of stranger danger and told him no, and that's when he picked the youngest boy in the crowd, and he picked up Anthony, held a knife to his throat, and threw him in his car. His body was found 2 weeks later, nude, and he was found sexually assaulted and bound with duct tape. And there was actually a sketch of this man made from the kids who had seen him as well, and there were fingerprints taken from the duct tape on Anthony, but both of these cases had gone cold until now, because they believed that Joseph could be responsible. There were also many more that he was being looked into for between the years of 1994 and 1997 when he was on parole, as well as when he was released from prison between 2000 and 2005. And when Joseph was arrested in 2005 for the Groene murders, people began to speculate that he was the same man that was in the Anthony Martinez sketch because he looked so much like him. And this was 8 years prior, but he still looked a lot like him. And this is when the fingerprint that they had found on the duct tape was tested, and it was a match to Joseph. At this point, Joseph then confessed to the other murders of Sammy Jo and of Carmen in Seattle. And he also said that when he killed Anthony, Anthony told him that he knew he would be going to heaven. Joseph explained that the night he killed the 2 girls, he was out getting some ice cream that night, and he saw them walking by into a back alley, and he thought that he could grab them without anybody knowing. So he followed them, and he was in the back alley with them when he told them that he owned the building and wanted to know what they were doing there. And then they believed they were in trouble, so they followed him into this car, and he drove them out to an abandoned barn and tried to sexually assault them, but wasn't successful, so he killed them quickly. The next day, he went out and he assaulted the bodies, and he dismembered one of them and buried them. Then a story was found that involved more survivors, because he said he was looking for more children to abduct in the next few months, and he saw a mother and her 2 boys leaving a Target, and he followed them and he went to their home, and he got the mother out, told the kids to stay in the bedroom, and he was about to attack her with a hammer and then grab the boys and leave. However, that is when her husband walked through the door and he ran. These were people who were so close to death by a serial killer, and they had no idea until Joseph was caught. All of these attacks and murders were said to be basically a revenge plot against being in prison for so many years and his need to harm society. That was his MO. It wasn't a certain type of victim. It was the fact that he just wanted to harm society as a whole. Now, he was going on trial for the murders of the Groene family on October 26th of 2005, but he would plead guilty to all charges against him in a plea bargain, and they would, go straight through to the sentencing, and he would be given 3 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole, and those were for the state charges. Now, he was actually sentenced to death for the federal charges and given 3 additional life sentences. This was appealed, but Joseph said this was actually done against his wishes and he didn't appeal it. Now, while in jail, he was actually diagnosed with pedophilia, sadistic personality disorder, antisocial personality disorder, and narcissistic traits. 6 years later, in 2011, Joseph pled guilty again to the Anthony Martinez murder and was given 2 more life sentences. And in all of these trials, the jurors were given counseling afterwards due to the brutality of the crime scenes. So now Joseph is in jail, and this is where you believe his story stops, right? Well, actually, it was found that he was still blogging even while in prison. And in 2010, the post started again, and it was believed that he was talking to somebody on the outside through letters and telling them what to write. And these are just basically meaningless entries of the mind of a man who really wants you to know that, what he thinks about and who he is, and like getting into the mind of a serial killer. But he loves that. He wants people to know why he did what he did because he believes he has that justification. because he was put in jail for so many years. It is believed that he gave investigators the code for the encrypted journal in one of the plea bargains. That was one of the things he had to do, but I don't think that's been released, or I couldn't find anything about it. Now, unfortunately, Shasta, being now the only member of her family besides her father to be alive, she really struggled as she grew up. The community actually came together and really tried to help, and when she was 10, they created a trust and they built a home for her to live in. And this was after her father, Steve, had actually said that they were homeless, they didn't have very much money, and he was now trying to raise a daughter he wasn't previously trying to raise. And this led to Shasta kind of going down a dark path when she was a teenager. At 17 years old, she was arrested and sent to a juvenile detention center for a year due to drugs. She was charged with 2 misdemeanor charges that she actually pled guilty to. After this, she vowed to change her life, and she said that she had turned to drugs and alcohol for so many years to try to deal with what had happened to her, but she wanted to get on the right track. And Shasta said that it was really hard for her because everyone knew her as the girl who survived a kidnapping. That's how people treated her, was some sort of celebrity that they knew, and she just wanted to feel normal because she said that any time that they would bring up her past, she just was reliving it, and it was almost like she felt like she could have done something to help. She actually got engaged to a man that she absolutely adores. They have such a deep connection, and she got pregnant at, I believe, 18. And Shasta actually considered her baby a miracle because she really figured from all of these sexual assaults that she wouldn't be able to conceive. Now, at this point, this age, she actually started to do interviews and talk about what had happened to her, as well as, you know, celebrating her family's birthdays and trying to remember the good memories instead of the bad, and she was just trying to put herself on a better track than she had been. She is really close to her biological father now, and she also had written, or had kind of decided what she was going to say to Joseph if she ever saw him. And she would say, "I'd want him to know that he doesn't control me, and he doesn't control how I feel. The person who took away my family and my innocence, but I don't ever really think about him. It's just my family. And I want him to know he doesn't have any power right now because he's the one sitting in prison while I'm out living my life." And she had seriously thought about what she would say because she might actually say it to him one day. Because one of his last requests as he was taken away from that Denny's was for her to come and visit him when she was older. And she's considered this, just to tell him that he doesn't control her anymore. When Shasta was 19, she actually started a petition called Slade and Dillon's Law that's for convicted sex offenders to not be let out of jail. 2 years later, things started to go downhill for Shasta again. Her and her father were actually evicted from the very house that people had built for her to live in, and this was because she was no longer living in it with him. She was living on her own, and her father was living in this home. And so they had been wanting to support Shasta in her new home, but they couldn't afford to do both. So they were kind of forcing her father out of this home and saying that they would need to sell it to have money to support her elsewhere. And this was very hard on her because it was her father. She wanted to help him, but you know, there was only so much she could do. Then in June of 2018, Shasta would actually plead guilty to 2 misdemeanor counts of injury to a child. And at this point, she did have 2 children of her own. And this was because she had left drugs near them. She actually didn't get any prison time. She was on probation, and she violated those terms of probation, so then they put her on supervised probation for a while. And Shasta at this point didn't show up to any of the treatment programs that she was supposed to be going to, but she had gotten a full-time job and her drug tests were coming back clean, so they figured she was doing okay. Then it was February of 2019, and Shasta was now 22. She had 2 children who were Lorenzo and Amari. They were 2 and 1, and they would all go missing. That's right, the girl who had been abducted all those years prior was now missing with her own children. They were last seen at a local Walmart between like 3 and 6 p.m. one evening, and the search began after social media posts started posting more and more, like from her family, saying that they couldn't find her. And thankfully the next evening they were found safe and sound, and not much more is known about the story, about what happened, where they were. But they were all safe and everything went back to normal after that. That December, Steve, her father, actually passed away, one of the last members of her immediate family who was still alive. He had battled with lung cancer and had passed, and Shasta went online to ask people for prayers for her family. She said that Steve was a hero to her and that he always talked about seeing his sons, Slade and Dylan, in heaven one day, and that now he got to. There have been no updates that I could find since then about Shasta and her family, but I do hope that they are doing well. And she went through such a difficult thing, and trusted instinct, she didn't even know where they were coming from, and she had never had to deal with something like this before, and she survived. And I can understand why she is struggling so much, why she did struggle, and I just hope that she, you know, gets the help that she deserves, whether that's therapy, whether that's just talking to friends about what she went through, because I truly believe that she can overcome all of this, and she deserves such a happy life after what she's been through. And I just want her to know that her story inspires so many people, including me, and I hope it inspires you as well. But that's why I wanted to share it, because it's so empowering, and I just want her to know that she deserves a good life. What she went through made her a warrior. It didn't make her only a victim. That's not a label that she has to wear in vain. A warrior is who she is, and I look up to her. I do hope she's not struggling as much anymore, and that peace is surrounding her, and that she's not in so much pain all the time. She saved her life, and that's such a wonderful thing to celebrate. I hope you guys enjoyed this story, a survival story again, but it's so much more than that, and it's, you know, murders that happened that were finally solved. There's so much to this, and so much that should have been done about Joseph before this could have even happened. So yeah, I hope you guys are doing well during this time, keeping your heads up, keeping some positivity with you, and spreading it to the world. And don't ever forget to speak up. Your voice is powerful enough, and I love you to absolute pieces. Okay, bye!